What if the United States deployed military forces to Venezuela's shores? This is not a prediction, but a thought experiment to explore the consequences of such an action. Imagine US naval ships in the Caribbean, tensions rising, and global powers watching closely. The impact would ripple through politics, economics, and the lives of ordinary people. Every action could trigger unpredictable reactions worldwide, a true domino effect. Ultimately, this scenario challenges the government of Nicolas Maduro and tests international resolve. US-Venezuela relations are deeply fractured, marked by sanctions, political division, and a devastating humanitarian crisis. The US supports opposition leader Juan Guaidó, while Maduro's government accuses the US of imperialism and interference. Ordinary Venezuelans suffer from shortages, hyperinflation, and mass migration. In this volatile environment, any US military movement risks igniting a dangerous regional crisis. The US and Venezuela's relationship has long been shaped by oil and ideology. Once close trading partners, tensions escalated with Hugo Chávez's anti-US stance and socialist revolution. Chávez's alliances and oil-funded policies challenged US influence, fueling decades of distrust. Oil became a weapon as relations soured, setting the stage for ongoing conflict and suspicion. The US imposed escalating sanctions on Venezuela, starting with targeted measures and expanding to cripple the nation's vital oil industry. The result: economic collapse, hyperinflation, and widespread shortages. The Maduro government blames US sanctions, while the US blames corruption and mismanagement. This standoff fuels propaganda and deepens the crisis, with no clear end in sight. Venezuela's crisis has created a humanitarian catastrophe. Hospitals lack supplies, food is scarce, and millions face malnutrition. Over 7 million have fled, triggering one of the largest migrations in the region's history. Neighboring countries struggle to cope as public services are overwhelmed and social tensions rise. Any military intervention risks worsening the crisis, putting vulnerable people in even greater danger. The US would likely deploy a small, carefully chosen naval task force, not a full invasion fleet, to project power near Venezuela. The core would be an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, bristling with advanced sensors and Tomahawk missiles, serving as both command center and deterrent. A Coast Guard Legend-class cutter would join, providing a law enforcement cover story, counter-narcotics or maritime safety, adding plausible deniability. This mix of military and law enforcement assets creates ambiguity about US intentions, complicating Venezuela's response. Overhead, P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft would monitor the region, tracking Venezuelan movements and providing real-time intelligence. The ships would depart from US bases like Mayport, Florida, maintaining secrecy, then operate just outside Venezuela's territorial waters, but within its exclusive economic zone. This positioning maximizes pressure, close enough to be a constant reminder, but technically legal under international law. The task force's presence would be a visible, persistent challenge to the Maduro government, signaling US resolve without immediate escalation. Every move would be calculated to keep tensions high but short of outright war. The US would publicly claim its mission is to support humanitarian aid delivery, painting itself as a force for good. Simultaneously, it would cite counter-narcotics operations, leveraging international law to justify stopping and searching vessels. Freedom of navigation. Operations would be another pretext, challenging Venezuela's maritime claims without direct confrontation. Beneath these justifications, the real aim is clear: a show of force to pressure Maduro and deter his allies, especially Russia and China. The ambiguity is intentional. Each objective appeals to a different audience. This layered messaging keeps adversaries guessing and gives the US flexibility to escalate or de-escalate as needed. It's coercive diplomacy at its sharpest, threatening action without firing a shot. The rules of engagement would be strict. US forces could only use force in self-defense, avoiding any first strike. Ships and aircraft would stay in international waters and airspace, never crossing into Venezuelan territory without top-level approval. Communications with Venezuelan forces would be professional, emphasizing lawful operations under international norms. Any hostile act, like radar lock or aggressive maneuvering, would trigger a measured, pre-planned escalation, from warnings to defensive actions. Contingency plans would cover every scenario: harassment of aid ships, close encounters in the air, or provocations at sea. The mission's success would hinge on discipline and clarity. One mistake could spark war. The line between deterrence and disaster would be razor thin. Every decision would be scrutinized, with the world watching for the slightest misstep. Even a limited US deployment would send shockwaves through Latin America, reviving memories of past interventions. The risk of military escalation is real. A single miscalculation could ignite a conflict neither side can control. Venezuela's neighbors, especially Colombia and Brazil, would face impossible choices: support the US and risk retaliation, or refuse and strain alliances. Refugee flows would surge, overwhelming borders and resources. Regional organizations like the OAS would fracture, with countries split between condemning Maduro and denouncing US intervention. Caribbean nations, caught between US security and Venezuelan economic ties, would be forced to pick sides. Shipping and tourism would suffer, turning the Caribbean from a zone of peace into a theater of great power rivalry. The deployment would destabilize the region for years, sowing mistrust and division. The cost of a show of force could be a generation of instability. A US naval move would instantly globalize the crisis, drawing in Russia and China, Venezuela's key backers. At the UN, Russia and China would condemn the US, paralyzing the Security Council and exposing deep international rifts. US allies in Europe would urge restraint, wary of intervention and its unpredictable fallout. Divisions within the EU would weaken Western pressure on Maduro, while countries with close Venezuelan ties would push for dialogue. Across the developing world, the US would face accusations of imperialism, damaging its soft power and fueling anti-American sentiment. Many would see the deployment not as humanitarian, but as another example of big power bullying. The diplomatic fallout would make future US-led coalitions harder to build. The world would be watching and judging America's every move. A US military deployment against Venezuela would spark fierce debate at home. Congress would question its legality, triggering heated hearings and partisan clashes. Public opinion would be sharply divided, with supporters citing humanitarian needs and security, while opponents warn of another endless war. The president would face relentless scrutiny, and the issue could define upcoming elections. The arrival of US warships would let the Maduro government claim proof of a US plot, rallying support and silencing dissent. State media would frame Maduro as a defender of sovereignty, while the opposition would be trapped, supporting intervention risks being called traitors, but condemning it alienates allies. Most tragically, ordinary Venezuelans would face greater repression and a worsening humanitarian crisis. The arrival of US warships would spark immediate outrage from Venezuela. Maduro's government would condemn the move as an act of aggression, rallying supporters and broadcasting nationalist propaganda. Across Latin America, reactions would be divided. Allies like Cuba and Bolivia would denounce the US, while countries like Colombia and Brazil would respond with cautious diplomacy. Others, such as Mexico and Argentina, would urge restraint and call for peaceful dialogue, reflecting the region's deep divisions and hopes for a diplomatic solution. The international community's reaction would be sharply polarized, turning the Venezuelan crisis into a global geopolitical chess match. At the United Nations, divisions would paralyze any action, with the US, Russia, and China vetoing each other's resolutions. The Organization of American States would be torn apart, unable to reach consensus as member states clash over intervention. Humanitarian groups like the Red Cross and UN agencies would warn that militarization threatens aid delivery and civilian safety. The presence of US warships could make the Venezuelan government suspicious of all aid, endangering humanitarian workers and leaving the vulnerable at risk. US military intervention in Venezuela would be driven by a mix of motives: humanitarian concerns, regime change, countering Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence, and protecting US economic and security interests. Washington frames intervention as protecting Venezuelans, but also seeks to secure oil, combat narcotics, and reassert US power in the region. Ultimately, it's about shaping Venezuela's future and limiting adversaries' foothold near US borders. A US military intervention in Venezuela would likely plunge the country into chaos and violence, with devastating long-term consequences. Civil war could erupt, drawing in global powers and worsening the humanitarian crisis. Millions might flee, infrastructure would collapse, and recovery could take generations, if it happens at all. The scars of intervention would haunt Venezuela for decades to come. A US military intervention in Venezuela would revive memories of past interventions, fueling anti-American sentiment and distrust across Latin America. The US would lose diplomatic influence, while rivals like Russia and China could exploit the chaos. Regional instability, economic disruption, and a refugee crisis would follow, isolating the US and weakening its global standing. A US military intervention in Venezuela would be a high-stakes gamble, fraught with peril and far-reaching consequences. The risks, regional instability, global tensions, and domestic division would likely outweigh any short-term gains. Venezuelan civilians would suffer most, caught between foreign intervention and internal repression. History shows the true cost of intervention is paid in blood, treasure, and lasting instability. A US intervention in Venezuela would cast a long dark shadow over the region, likely sparking conflict and deepening the humanitarian crisis. Instead of stability, it could lead to displacement, suffering, and a broken nation. The US would lose credibility and influence, fueling anti-American sentiment across Latin America. Military intervention is a blunt instrument. Diplomacy, though slow, is the wiser path. The legacy would be instability, resentment, and suffering for generations.